All right, when we start in on 2-2, we're going to be talking about conditional statements. Now, these are statements that fit the format of if then. So let's write a fairly straightforward if then statement. If, I'll change up my colors, we're going to be moving stuff around a lot. If it's raining, then, and we'll get another one. Practice is inside. And that's a fairly straightforward, easy to understand conditional statement. If it is raining, then practice is inside. So we can see that one idea leads to another. And so we can orient our if-then statement like that. Now I have a nice, neat statement. So the idea is that raining causes a result. If P, then Q. And you'll see that a lot in our notation. If P, then Q. What that represents symbolically is this statement. And in this statement, the letter P represents the idea that it's raining. The letter Q represents the idea that we are going to be practicing inside. So rain leads to, thus the arrow, practice being inside. Now, some other words you're going to hear applied. You'll hear the word implies. So for example, in that phrase, we would say raining implies practicing inside. We usually try to stay with this if and only, if and then as our main statement. You might also hear phrases along the lines of all times, using the word all. So for example, I might say, all the time that it rains, we practice inside. In other words, raining leads to practicing inside. So all the time it rains leads to practicing inside. And these are other words that we use to set up this conditional statement. When I say a conditional statement, I'm talking specifically about a statement with an if and a then in it, where one part, the if part, leads to a conclusion, the practice being inside part. That's a logical flow. When we talked about the gift shop example, we talked about, for example, the fact that one of the characters might get fired. Many of you have already internalized this conditional statement that if you are late, if you are absent without calling in. Let me simplify that too. So if absent without notice, then there's a consequence. Then you are fired. That's a conditional statement most of us already know coming into this, or hopefully we know it. So again, I have this idea of having an if part, and then a then, and then my statement has the lead in, so absent without calling and letting them know, and then a result. You get fired. So in this case, again, the P leads to the Q. That's also important to note that a conditional statement does not imply that it goes the other way. So for example, we don't know for certain that every time someone is fired, that they were absent without notice. Lots of other things can result in getting fired. Perhaps, for example, they mouthed off to the boss, or their cash till was low, or they mouthed off to the wrong customer who was not going to leave until they saw someone get fired. We can use a Venn diagram to illustrate these ideas. So if I take an oval there, and I'm going to label this oval, again, we're going to use the example we talked about the character who was going to get fired for being absent or skipping work. Everyone who is absent is going to get fired. So that means that being absent from work is inside the circle that represents people who get fired. So you can see everyone inside the absent group is inside the get fired group, but not the other way around. I can have people who get fired for all other kinds of reasons. There are all these various points in the Venn diagram that are not inside people who are absent from work. Now, one other thing I want to add on to this card of ideas here is the idea that these parts have names. We call the if part of the statement the hypothesis. Now be very careful. In the context of logic, hypothesis does not mean educated guess like it does in science. I'm willing to bet on our first quiz of vocabulary, somebody is going to say that hypothesis is an educated guess. Don't be that somebody. Practice inside the then part we call the conclusion. So take a moment and think about this. If I were to ask you to define the word hypothesis, what would you write? If I asked you to define the word conclusion, what would you write? Hypothesis refers to the if part of a conditional statement, and conclusion refers to the then. And those are perfectly valid ways of defining them. It starts with the idea of understanding what a conditional statement is, which is a statement in the form of an if-then statement that links two ideas together. We can use a Venn diagram to illustrate them. The Venn diagram is the diagram here with the circles that show us what's grouped together. And then the conditional statement has a hypothesis and a conclusion. And lastly, can be expressed symbolically, where the letter P represents an idea that then leads to, through the use of an arrow, to another idea, that idea being the Q.